Dr. Boer, nice to have you on Channels Book Club.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for coming. The history of football in Nigeria, fascinating subject, fascinating books. Well done.
Thank you. Thank you.
What led you to write this?
Well, you know, I was actually, I may not look like it, but I was actually born and raised in Nigeria. So I'm Nigerian by birth and upbringing. I first grew up in Taraba and then Plateau later. And just growing up here, I think anyone who's lived here for any amount of time recognizes how amazing Nigerian football is, but also just how popular it is. And so I had that in the back of my mind, you know, when I went to graduate school. And while I was in graduate school doing my doctoral work on African history, I was basically, you know, I needed to think of what my doctoral topic was going to be. So the first 2 years of grad school, while I was doing coursework, I would ask every Nigerian I met anywhere in the world, whether Nigeria or abroad, a question of what is something that is national, positive, unifying, and historical for Nigeria. And the only answer I got was football, regardless of gender, ethnicity, religion, age, socioeconomic class. It was always the same single answer, football. So for me, that was awesome because I love the topic, I love the concept. The problem was, how was I going to convince my professors at Yale that this was a topic worthy of historical study at that kind of university? Thankfully, my main professor was actually from the Gambia. So he understood it right from when I talked to him about it.
West Africa loves football.
Exactly. And so he was very, very supportive, and then he helped convince the other professors, and I guess the rest is history. And so basically this comes out of my doctoral work from 15 years ago. And a few years ago, it was probably 2014, 2015, I met Bankole Olayebi from Bookcraft, the publisher of Bookcraft. And we got talking, and I mentioned this manuscript I had from my doctoral work, and he just loved it, and he said, look, give me the chance, let's make this into a book. And you know, this is what came out of it.
And apparently from what you've said, growing up in Jos, football had made a very powerful impression on your mind.
Yes.
Back then, there was a lot of, football was better organized in Nigeria. We had the league, we had the clubs like Mighty Jets of Jos, and so on. So that formed the impression, right, for you?
Yes, it did. And you know, as youngsters, you know, we would go to the Jos Township Stadium. It was, you know, if you think of it now, it probably broke every safety code. And we would, you know, line up, and you know, there'd be like soldiers whipping us to keep us in line and all that. But it was still great fun. And you know, we'd watch Mighty Jets or Highlanders, and then Plateau United, all sorts of these different teams. And they would play clubs from all over Nigeria. It was fantastic. But in those days also, you know, in the late 80s and early 90s, there was also very organized secondary school football, which sort of was where the players who made it into the leagues came from. And there was a lot of, you know, competition and so on, and we don't have any of that anymore. And so now, you know, if you look at kind of the stars of the game now, in many ways they just kind of, everyone sort of is ad hoc and makes it out of some kind of one luck or the other. There's not a sort of organized process for that. Yeah.
This is from 1904.
That's correct.
And you know, I found a lot of things fascinating in your work, very revealing for somebody like myself who's also a fan of the game. Learning about how the colonial masters back then brought in football and sold football to the natives, you know, and how they used football as a unifying force, you know, how they used football in some ways, maybe you didn't directly state that in your book, also as a manipulative tool, you know, in some way.
Yeah.
I had the impression,
okay.
Maybe you need to correct me on that.
Yeah.
You know, so 1904, why 1904?
Well, so 1904 is the date that we found the earliest recorded game. There was a game played by students at the Hope Waddell Training Institute in Calabar, which was founded by Presbyterian missionaries. And they played a game against sailors from a British ship that was docked in Calabar. Now, the Nigerian youngsters at the school actually beat the British sailors. So based on that, you imagine they had probably been playing for a while. But in any case, that's the earliest recorded game that we've seen. That I was able to find. And then I think in Lagos, the earliest was around 1906. And then actually the other place that was really early was Zaria, which was 1907. But in both Zaria and Calabar, it was actually missionaries who brought it. It wasn't the colonial state. The colonial government was promoting cricket, polo, horse racing, all those kinds of sort of elite sports. And football was more promoted by missionaries, by the sort of lower level colonial officials, by the tradesmen, traders, the railway workers, that kind of thing. So in fact, football was actually the sport that it was more Nigerians took it and almost protested against colonialism by adopting it as their game. As early as World War II, Nnamdi Azikiwe used football very, very cleverly as a way to protest colonial rule. He made 2 national tours with players from his various clubs, and they would basically be playing for support of the war effort, to raise money for the war effort. So that you'd have Azikiwe and then whoever was the most senior colonial official in that particular location, whether it was a provincial resident, as they called it, in some cases even the sort of governors of the regions. And they would be standing right there, and after the game he would give a speech about liberty, democracy, freedom, what they were fighting for in the war, and he was basically implying we are also fighting for that in Nigeria. And they couldn't arrest him, lock him up or anything, because he was using football as a way to protest that. So, and then in the late 1940s and early 1950s, and then all the way through the 1950s, football was very much used by Nigerians themselves to kind of create a Nigerian national identity and a sense of pride in the nation, long before it became independent. So it really was not a tool of colonial domination, and that's, I think, what made the game so beautiful.
How quickly did Nigerians adopt the game?
Right, so it started in Calabar in 1904, became very popular. By 1906, there was already like a tournament that was funded by a British British military officer. But in 1906, the capital of the Southern Protectorate of Nigeria moved to Lagos. And so a lot of these guys now moved to Lagos and then took the game with them, and then it became much more popular in Lagos and spread very widely in Lagos. And even though for a long time Calabar was the source of some of the best players, so when the first Nigerian national team went to the UK in 1949, of the 18 players, I think 9 of them were from Hope Waddell Training Institute. They were all from Calabar. That's how long the domination continued. But Lagos is really where it now blossomed, and then leagues developed. The Lagos District Amateur Football Association was founded there. The NFA was founded in Lagos in 1933, and in many ways it was really a Lagos association for the first year until they started inviting other associations from around the country. But then from Lagos, it spread, like I said, in Surrey, it was already there in around 1907. And then it really spread as schools were set up, or as railway stations were set up around the nation, and Nigerians and British expats who were working for these different institutions moved to these different places. They would now take football with them. They would play it locally. People from outside of the institution would see it, and they would start playing it outside the walls of the school. And that's really how it permeated. So by the time we were in the late 20s, early 30s, I would find references to people playing football in obscure towns that even today you don't even know them today.
No.
And so that it really was in every nook and cranny of Nigeria by the 1930s.
I'm going to come back to how you researched on this, because it's really interesting. But there were a lot of revealing things around some of the things you just casually mentioned now, like the 1933 NFA being formed in 1933. You said that. Well, not you said. We've always thought NFA was formed in 1945.
That's what's on the back.
Even NFA says it was formed in
badge,
1945. So 1933, you found
I mean, the
out.
documentary evidence, I found newspapers that clearly say, the first meeting of the NFA to hold tomorrow at the health office, which is on Broad Street. It's still there. It's now, I think, a local government office. So the building is still there. And it's very clear who attended. The next day there's sort of an article in the paper also about who attended, who was elected. And that was 1933. And I mean, every year from then on, there was something in the press about the Nigerian Football Association.
So why has NFA been saying they were founded in 1945? When there are newspaper evidences?
So there's a journalist, Kunle Solaja, who's sort of on a campaign about this. And for some reason, the NFA hasn't really responded, because the evidence is there. The only thing we can think of is that 1945 was when the Governor's Cup, or the Challenge Cup, it's now the Iteo Cup, which is the longest continuous tournament in Nigeria.
Then 1949, the guys who went to the UK, the first UK tour, playing barefooted. That was also very interesting.
So in 1949, a tour of England was organized by 18 players. The Nigerian national team was called the Red Devils at the time, simply because they wore red jerseys. and the Nigerian flag in colonial times had red on it. So that's basically where it came from. And they toured England. It was 18 players. You know, they basically selected the best players from the local leagues. So there were a lot of players from Marine, which was one of the leading teams in the Lagos League. Railway was the other leading team. Etim Henshaw from Calabar, from Hope Waddle Training Institution, was the captain. He was also the captain of Marine. And then the vice captain was Titus Okere, who was from Railway. And it wasn't really known at the time, but apparently there was a huge rivalry between those guys. And the Railway guys said, why was Henshaw the captain? The captain should be from Railway. They were the best team. They had the most members. So behind the veil, there was, you know, and I learned this from meeting these guys like 50 years later, right?
Whoa. While you were writing this.
Yeah, while I was doing the research. But they basically did this tour of England. Of the 18, there was one player from northern Nigeria, only one. His name was John Dunkaro. He actually was from Takum in what is now Taraba
quite a
State.
player.
And he became a star in the Jos tin mining leagues. He actually eventually afterwards, you know, went to university in England, became the head of the tin mines in Jos. His brother Sunday Dunkaro became the chairman of the Nigerian Football Association. So they had a long sort of career in this. And then they played barefoot. And now some people, the impression of that is, because these were like really local guys who didn't wear shoes. But remember, these guys were actually all executives in colonial institutions. They were well-educated men who wore suits and ties and shoes to the office. But when they went to the football field, they felt, look, they have better control when they play without shoes. So it wasn't that they were somehow, you know, not modern, but they just felt for football, shoes weren't necessary.
Well, we could go on and on and on about this.
Yeah.
Very interesting, but we're out of time. Dr. Boer, thank you for joining us on Channel's Book Club.
Thank you very much.
Nice to have you here.
You bet. Thanks.
It's amazing how much of Nigerian history we need to learn about. Fortunately, more books are being written to share some of these stories with us. Well, I hope you have enjoyed today's episode. As always, we'll be delighted to get your feedback through any of our social media platforms displayed on your screen. I am Olakunle Kasumo. Remember, one great book can change your life. Bye-bye.